okay, I'll admit, it's a bit rich of me to come here on the internet and go, your Wi-Fi, it sucks. You know, if I was sitting at home and I saw somebody saying that, I'll admit that they're probably right, because at times I wish it worked just a little bit better, but you'd probably also be slightly offended. I know I would. But I'm hoping to give you a few tips, a few pointers. I'm not tech support, so seriously, do not ring me at 4 o'clock in the morning going, well, you gave all those wonderful tips on the internet, I changed it and it didn't work. Or the crime rate in your immediate vicinity, i.e. your household, may go up significantly as I turn up rather annoyed and angry. Actually, that cost me a lot of money. I'll just ignore you instead. It's more fun. But what I will do is I'll go through some of the things and little nerd noms and things that you can tweak or make your wireless network work just a little bit better. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to start with the simplest stuff, so the really easy, basic stuff that almost anyone can change, and then work through to the more technical and geeky things as we go along. Now, I'm not an expert. I'll never claim to be an expert in anything other than, well, I guess pontificating and making bad suggestions, but you know, I'll give what advice I do have. And with this video, it's going to sound bizarre coming from somebody who's making one of these videos, but I'm going to say, feel free to tap out at any point. But I think we'll start with the simplest thing, and it's location. We apologise for the interruption to this video. We hope to return shortly after some legal issues are worked out. We can now go back to our regularly scheduled programme. No, I can't use that term. I got into trouble last time, didn't I? Where you put the wireless access point or router, whatever you want to call it, it can have an impact on signal throughout where you live, covering your whole house. Now let's start small. Let's imagine that you happen to live in something a bit like this. Oops. Learning how to draw at the same time as talking into video. It's a great way to do it. I highly recommend it. As a way to make a bit of an idiot of yourself. So imagine you live in an old-fashioned camping tent like this. Yes, it looks kind of like a Toblerone. It is incredibly old-fashioned, but just imagine that you genuinely live somewhere like this. Where you put your access point almost doesn't matter. You could put it here, or you could put it here, or either the best place in the middle, which should cover the whole shebang. You'll be covered. Especially so because you've got these nice thin walls and it all works brilliantly. But let's imagine you live somewhere slightly bigger. So let's imagine you live in a 2 up, 2 down special. I'm going to say it's detached because somehow you've won the lottery as well. You've got a nice house, windows. You know, the classic, you ask a kid to draw a picture of a house. You know, that's the sort of thing. Now, as your house expands, you'll probably want to pick a more central location. So imagine you've got your access point down here in the living room, and up here you've got your mobile phone, which looks like something out of the 1990s or the 1980s, because that's how I draw mobile phones, I'll be honest with you. Now, as your house is expanding, you put it more and more central, you're covering more of the house. And this works especially if you've got modern stud walls, because you've got to remember, if you've got your access point away down in the living room, and your mobile phone's away up here, you've got to be able to talk through all those stud walls and people and whatever else happens to get in the way. And it's not a one-way problem either. So just because your mobile phone can hear the access point in the living room doesn't mean the access point can hear your mobile phone. Remember, this is running on a battery. Your mobile phone is battery powered. It doesn't talk as loudly as your access point does, or your router, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't talk as loudly. It's a two-way conversation. So if you've got especially thick walls, so you're not a proper old-fashioned brick house, or like, you know, this place, you know, it's got some brick walls, and there's warm body things like this. You know, we're made of water. We absorb a lot of radio waves. But if you're in something like that, then it becomes much more difficult to have that conversation between your mobile phone and the access point. Well, how do you fix that one? Well, you could pick a central location, but you might start to have problems, especially as your house gets bigger. So let's imagine you've now got a little granny flat attached off at the side here. I don't know why you're putting your granny out in the shed, but let's imagine you put granny in the shed here. She wants Wi-Fi as well. It's got to get all the way across that gap. That's a big, big distance for it to cover. And, you know, there might be all sorts in the way. You know, there might be metal fences, metalwork really messes with radio signals. Anything like that getting in the way will cause trouble. So the trick when you start to do that is you'll want to have more and more and more different radios and access points. And it gets a little bit confusing because you could go and buy a pack from, a bunch of people do them nowadays, but it's a bunch of 3 separate radios, and you could put, one up here, one down there, and one in the granny flat, and that'll give you a bit of coverage. And that's one of the first big things that you can improve your Wi-Fi service with. So beyond location, so that's your start point. Beyond location, what things can we change to make it work? Well, time for a little bit of theory. Now, while there are a ton of controls and options, and you dig into your wireless router, there'll be a million different features you can play around with it. There are 3 main things that you can adjust that can make a real difference to things in a wireless network. They are power, channel, and channel width. Now, power is the simplest one. Imagine Tim Toolman, power, more power type stuff. How powerful do you want to make your signal? This simplest approach you would think would be crank the power right up. So let's imagine we're doing that. So let's have a little box here. Oops. That is our wireless router access point thing. Hello. And at the other end here, we're going to have your mobile phone or your laptop or whatever else you happen to have on Wi-Fi. I've always got big antennas because apparently it's 20 odd years ago when I'm drawing this thing. Now, one of the things you could do is you could crank the power right up on this thing. So you could go all the way up to the top. And that's brilliant because all the devices down here will get a nice strong signal. Brilliant. You're thinking, yeah, it's working amazingly. So these chaps start talking back as well. Unfortunately, they can only send, let's say, about half the power. So it might be coming this way at full power. Whoops, I'm rubbish at this drawing stuff. There we go. So it might be coming this way at full power and coming back the other way at half power. Now you've got that little thing there. So imagine you're in a field and these are people shouting. So this one's shouting, this one's talking. You'll be able to hear what the person's shouting across the field, but they won't necessarily hear back from you what you're saying back. And that's a bit of a problem you sometimes get with Wi-Fi. So if you've ever had that thing where it says you've got 4 bars fully connected, everything's amazing, but it feels like you're not really connected and things are a bit hit or miss and it feels a bit broken, this might be it. You might have the power cranked up too high. What you really want to do is you want to have the power clipped down to just cover that smaller area you really want to have covered, so like the household or something like that. You can get into all sorts of problems if you've got the power cranked up where these devices still think they're connected, they're trying to talk, and they'll be steamrolling over all the airtime and everything else that's a bit closer as well. So you can actually have a knock-on effect where, because you've got the power too high, things are latched on and they're causing trouble for everything else that's much closer to the access point or the router. So be careful of that. Don't just ramp it all the way up and hope for the best. In fact, if you've got that big coverage gap, you're better sticking another access point, a bit closer, at much lower power, and they can chat amongst themselves. So that's one of the big obvious features you can play around with on a wireless network. The other 2 were channel and channel width. So to figure out what they're all about, let's talk about motorways or highways or whatever, autobahns, whatever you want to call them. Those big multi-lane road traffic things. So they look kind of like this, and you'll have, a bunch of lanes. So there we go. We've got a 1, 2, 3, 4 lane carriageway, and we're all going that direction. So imagine we're like a bunch of cars and lorries traveling down it. So if we've got a vehicle here, 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 they won't crash into each other. So they all want to travel down the motorway at the same time. That's brilliant. They can do that. And in the Wi-Fi world, that would be your different radio channels. So we've got 4 radio channels there. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we've got 4 separate communications happening. So we've got 4 separate vehicles traveling down that motorway. Where this can get messy is in the 2.4 gigahertz world. So there is 2 bands you'll see generally for Wi-Fi. There are some more ones available. You'll generally see 2.4, which is considered sort of older, more legacy stuff, and 5 gigahertz. In 2.4, you've got all of, I forget what they call it, it's 12 channels, but they overlap. So they're like having great big lorries that have to straddle across 2 or 3 separate lanes to travel down the road. And when they're doing that, you can't use all these other separate side lanes. Now, if you've got them straddling on separate sets of lanes, that's brilliant. But let's say you get somebody that's straddling like this. So there's our third one straddling across the middle there. Notice it blocks the other two from traveling along. Now, this is a real issue you see in 2.4 gigahertz. If you're not sitting on channels 1, 6, and 12, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, there are 13, 14 options available as well in certain selection of countries. If you want to upset Americans, it's beautiful. Put your Wi-Fi on channel 13. Not great advice in public places, but if you're sitting on those channels, brilliant. But if you're the clever clogs that comes along and goes, I'm going to put mine on channel 4, well, brilliant, you've just become that big lorry that's chundering down the middle there. But you don't recognise there's somebody in your lane. You can't see them covering your whole lane. And the same with this other one. So you end up colliding with each other. You're just treating each other like interference. You're not like the cars along here where you can see each other and you can queue up. So yeah, I want to be a bit careful with that. So channel is one of the big ones. And in 2.4 gigahertz, you've got to be a bit careful with that. So it might be worth checking, what channel has your Wi-Fi settled down on? If it's settled down on anything other than 1, 6, or 12, have a look at it and maybe adjust it so you're not making your life miserable and your neighbour's lives miserable as well. But in the 5 gigahertz world, we don't have to worry about this straddling so much. Each channel is separate. It doesn't overlap. You don't have that problem. What you do have is you can still have big massive vehicles like this travelling down the road because you can combine channels together. But your devices are a little more clever and they can tell, well, actually, you know what, this is 2 channels strapped together. I'm not going to slam on top of each other. They will queue up cleanly behind each other. You'll all take turns. If somebody's already transmitting, you won't slap on top of them type stuff. You'll all behave. But you are burning a lot of spectrum in the process. So there is a point, in the 5 gigahertz world, you can have up to, I think it's 8 channels combined together. They don't have to be all adjacent. You can have 8 channels combined together, just so you can get your connection to be just that little bit faster. It's not worth it, in all honesty, especially if you live somewhere like a high-rise flat or somewhere there's a lot of people close by with their own wireless networks. It just turns into chaos, and you'll find you don't get to use all that spectrum very cleanly very often. So you're better, and this is going to sound weird, having lots of separate little channels than bundling things together. So if you've got an option in your Wi-Fi that says, go 80 megahertz wide channels, whittle it down. 40, not a bad compromise. 20, brilliant if you're in a high density, high-rise flats, anything like that. 80, 60, yeah, turn that off. You're causing trouble for yourself and for other people in the area. Unless you happen to live in the middle of nowhere, then knock yourself out. Have as much fun as you like with that one. So you've now got yourself in a position where you're going, right, okay, I'm going to get multiple access points. I'm going to spread them over a bunch of channels and it's going to be amazing. Oh, it turns out, my internet provider's doing one of those packs where I can get 3 different access points in one piece and I just have to plug it in one place and it all connects wirelessly. It's beautiful, it's mesh. And that could be slightly problematic depending on what your setup is. Now let me explain this one. So imagine you buy one of those packs from your provider. So you get 1, 2, 3. So they sell them generally as disc-shaped devices that go in your house. You spread them out around your house and that's what your device is going to be connected to. So let's imagine number 1 is the one that goes out to the big bad world. It goes out to the internet. So that's fine. So if your device is connected to number 1, you've only got 1 hop there. If you're connected to number 2, you've got 2 hops. So let's say that's your device. So you've got a hop from your device to number 2, and then a hop from 1 down to the internet as well. So that's 2 separate radio channels you're transmitting on and burning airtime to get your connection or your piece of information to or from your device. It gets even messier if you've got a third one as well. Because if your device is connected to number 3 and goes through number 2, that then goes through to number 1, that's 3 hops to get out and then 3 hops to get back. And that's for every little piece of information that comes to and from your device. The bad news is you're burning channels and airtime doing that. So if you can wire these up in the background, using I hate to advise this, but you know those Ethernet plug-in adapter thingies that'll connect up around your house, or if you can run a cable to them, even better, you know, you don't run into that problem. If your wireless network's quiet enough that you're only occasionally watching YouTube on one tablet, knock yourself out. If you're going really hard with it, you might find yourself fighting for airtime because you're just using so much of it, bouncing things back and forth along the line. So now you've got your wireless network set up pretty much as you hope. It's you've got all these devices, you've wired them in, or you're happy to accept, you know, mesh network will do the job for me. I'm happy to burn all that airtime bouncing back and forth. I don't care. It works. It does its job. But I'm still having a couple of problems, or I'm having intermittent problems. Intermittent problems can be the messiest ones to deal with. And one of the big ones we run into is interference. And especially in 2.4 gigahertz world, one of the biggest interferers looks something like this. It's got little circles. Goes like that. And you cook your internet. It's your microwave. So the way your microwave works, it is vibrating at the same sort of frequencies that Wi-Fi wants to use. And, you know, it's well shielded. It's not going to cause you any injuries or anything like that unless you've got a seriously broken one. But you are now running into a problem where it's now splattering over the top of your device, your phone that you're trying to watch YouTube on during your lunch break, or your laptop you're trying to work on while you're cooking your breakfast. They're fighting in the same bit of spectrum, unfortunately. So if you find you are having trouble, you might need to look at checking your microwave's not faulty, but also just get away from it. It can be one of the biggest sources of noise on these things. So another one you can run into, and this time in the 5 gigahertz range, is Dfs channels, which are nothing to do with sofas. So sofas don't have much of an impact on Wi-Fi unless yours happens to be made of lead. Then you do have trouble. But then you're getting lead poisoning from just sitting down watching telly on the sofa, so you've got bigger issues at that point. No, it's channels in the 5 gigahertz spectrum where Wi-Fi is a secondary user. So other people have dibs on the spectrum first. And the big one there is weather radar. So, you know, not always airplanes, but imagine you've got one coming along like that. Hello. A bit old-fashioned. He's got his wings there, his little engine. Hello. Pilot up the front, all the little windows. So to be able to see, well, big wet things like thunderstorms, and I guess you could look for a lot of people in them as well. You know, aircraft have radars on the front of them, but you'll also get static installations and things as well. So, you know, people like the Met Office will have great big chunking weather radars dotted around the country, and they'll be blasting out, looking for reflections coming back that are telling them there's a whole load of water up there. You might want to keep an eye on that and see how it's moving and progressing. You've seen all those wonderful coloured maps. Well, unfortunately, some of these radars use the same bit of spectrum as 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi does. And what's supposed to happen is that if your device is on one of those channels and it hears an emission coming in, and it's either knows it's coming from a weather radar or it's not sure, it must stop transmitting. Now, how long it stops transmitting for depends on the channel. There's a whole load of rules around it. But effectively, it shuts that chunk of your wireless network off for a good while. And you've got to wait for it to come back in, or, you know, pick another channel or reconfigure it or whatever. So there is sometimes a little switch you can find in your Wi-Fi settings to turn off Dfs channels. It's your own call on that one. You know, if you are finding you're having trouble, you're probably better staying off these channels. If you're in a relatively quiet area and you know it works fine, you can leave it switched on. But do remember, it is one of these things where if it gets a hint of noise on those channels, it will switch itself off because it knows it's got to leave way for the weather radar. If it doesn't do that, here's what it looks like. If I found a picture on the internet, and this is what happens to weather radar pictures when you don't follow the rules. So we looked at some of the big obvious stuff and we looked at some of the less obvious things. You know, you're looking for these DFS events happening. And yeah, much like the DFS sales, you can go check your router logs and see if they've appeared in there. But let's really get into the weeds now and look at some of the other things that we can consider. You know, I want to call them nerd knobs. We need a better term than that. Fancy technical stuff. I'm sure there must be an official term for it, but let's look at some of that stuff. And one of the big things you can do to improve the world on Wi-Fi is switch off some of the older things. So you might not realise Wi-Fi dates back to the late 90s. 1997 is when the first standards were ratified, and it's been going on ever since. So it's got a fair few years behind it, but some of the older standards had all sorts of things going on. So let's imagine you've got your wireless access point. I don't know why it looks like a transistor radio, but there we go. And you got your device over here, looks like an 80s mobile phone. And they want to talk to each other. And some of the older standards, there genuinely was extra communications running back and forth where it's going, can I send something? Yeah, go on, you can send something. Can I send something back? Yeah, go on, you can send something back. There's all making sure you're allowed to send before you send. There was a lot more airtime getting burned. And one of the things you can do to improve this is actually just switch off supports for some of the older standards. You don't need them. There are edge cases where it'd be useful. So if you happen to be in a massive warehouse with lots of metalwork and you're having all sorts of trouble with devices not being able to hear each other, then you might need some of these features. But in your home Wi-Fi network, you can probably switch them off fairly safely. Another one you can look at is that the access point is continually sending what we call beacons. So you ever wondered how, when you switch your device on, it knows there's a list of Wi-Fi networks there? Now it is going out and asking, hello, is there anything out there? But your wireless network is also sending out messages going, I'm here, I'm Wi-Fi 123, and here's a bunch of parameters about me. The bad news is that those beacons can take up a fair bit of airtime, especially if you've got support for some of the older, what they call basic rates switched on. So that's how slow you allow devices to be communicating with the network. What is the lowest speed you're allowed to connect at? If you're really unlucky, you've got it set all the way down at 1 megabit a second, and your mobile phone might be half a mile away, just managing to communicate back very slowly at 1 megabit a second. And that will consume huge amounts of airtime because, the same amount of information at slower speed is going to take much longer to get there. And you're going to make the experience horrible for everyone else because they've got to wait while that mobile phone is communicating back. So what you can do is you can switch off some of the slower basic rates and you can crank it all the way up to about 12 meg is usually a good shout. The bad news is if you've got some really old, off of Noah's Ark mobile phone or something like that, and it can't talk the basic rate back that it's requiring, so it can't do the 12 megabits a second or something like that, it will not be able to connect to the network. It just will not be able to make that connection, which would be quite unfortunate. So it's not so much of an issue at home where you might have modern mobile phones and tablets and things like that. But if you've got something off of Noah's Ark, or you've got a 50p wireless dongle you bought 20 years ago, you might have a bit of trouble. But 99% of the time you can safely turn off some of these older, what they're called basic rates. So have a look through the settings, knock it up to about 12, you'll be fine. And modern devices will be fine. Older devices, be a little bit careful. So you might have to experiment and try things out. It's all part of fun, isn't it? And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to playing with Wi-Fi options and my horrible artwork. I must apologise for how bad my drawing is. I know, I've seen it, I know it's horrific. But, when you get into bigger installations and you get into fancier stuff, a lot of they're doing these basic things. They're plotting where they're going to put access points so the devices will spread out across them and not everyone's fighting to talk to the same radio at the same time. It's all about spreading load, keeping cells small, keeping interactions as fast as possible. These principles apply small networks all the way up, and it doesn't take much to make those adjustments and improve things. You might find that you've shrunk your coverage area. You might have to think about buying a second access point or a mesh network or something like that, but you'll find it improves your life or improves your Wi-Fi experience. So it's a bit of experimentation to do. Try it out, see what happens. And you can get also into all sorts of clever stuff beyond this. You can get into traffic shaping, you can get into wireless multimedia and prioritizing bandwidth and turning radios off at certain times. And you can get all sorts of crazy stuff, and especially when you start getting into fancy authentication stuff. And you ever try to connect to your work Wi-Fi? It can get very complicated very quickly. But for a home Wi-Fi network, reasonable security settings, have a look at these basic sort of Wi-Fi options, trim them down a bit. You'll probably find that your experience will improve just a little bit and you're getting the best out of your service. Admittedly, there are some things you can't improve. If your Wi-Fi network can be the best thing since sliced bread, but Unfortunately, if your connection out to the wider internet is about as good as dial-up, it's going to be a poor experience. You can't, you can only go as fast to the internet as your internet service provider lets you. You could have a multi-gigabit Wi-Fi network that's, doing all sorts of clever stuff. But if you've only got a 2 meg connection to the internet, that's all you're going to get out of the internet. So there is a bit of a balancing act there. It's not worth getting really fancy, expensive home network equipment if you're only going to use it to watch YouTube and you've only got a 2 meg connection anyway. It's all about making sensible decisions, making the right choice for your scenario. It's up to you. Everyone's setup's different. Everything that you're after is a bit different. But this was just a little introduction to some of the things you can play with and adjust on your wireless network, and it might improve things. Hopefully it does. And I'm sure somebody will be down in the comments section going, well, actually, I would do this instead, or, a better way is to do that, And they might be right. I could be talking to you right now. You could be that person going, well, why didn't you talk about this? Well, bring it up and we'll have a wee chat about it in the comment section. I'm game for it. And on that note, this has been Technically Minded. We've looked at the basics. Let's be fair. This is just touching on the surface level stuff. You can go into all sorts of crazy stuff of how we can improve your wireless network, which I said is probably rubbish. And I do apologise for calling your home network rubbish. But hopefully you've gained something, and hopefully you'll watch another Technically Minded video in the future. I'm Mark. Apparently we're supposed to do that cheesy subscribe and all that thing, but you get the idea. You know what to do.